So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Chris Walker, Vice President of the Center for European Policy Analysis, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to the 2025 CEPA Forum Tech and Security Conference. This year marks 20 years of CEPA's leadership in action, 2 decades of strengthening the transatlantic alliance through cutting-edge research, analysis, and collaboration. CEPA's mission has always been to ensure a strong, democratic, and secure transatlantic alliance for future generations. We do this by providing insight into trends shaping democracy, security, and technology, and by building networks of future leaders committed to the transatlantic idea. Over the years, CEPA has welcomed to this annual flagship convening distinguished speakers such as former NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, Prime Minister Kaja Kallas, President Maya Sandu, and Senators Jean Shaheen and Roger Wicker, and innovators like Jose Andres and Eric Schmidt. We are honored once again to partner with the Embassy of Sweden for this year's event. Deep thanks to Prime Minister Ulf Kristersson, Ambassador Urban Allen, and their team for their partnership and collaboration. Grateful recognition also to our conference sponsors, Airbus, Lockheed Martin, Meta, and to Arterian, General Atomics, and Google for their support of CEPA's work. Today's program brings together leaders from government, industry, and the research sector to explore the intersection of technology and security and what it means for the future of the transatlantic alliance. We'll examine challenges in the industrial base, tech and trade, and the building blocks of AI. CEPA has been at the leading edge of the intersection of technology and defense, and we're proud to announce a just-released report, Tech 2030, a roadmap for Europe-U.S. tech cooperation, which offers recommendations for deeper U.S. tech cooperation to meet shared challenges, including strategic competition with China. This conference features a dynamic and distinguished lineup, including a panel on AI evolution and the geopolitics of the full stack, as well as one of Europe's defense boom and opportunities for transatlantic cooperation. We're pleased to have a keynote address from Representative Chrissy Houlihan, co-chair of the U.S. House Biotech Caucus, as well as a fireside chat with Anduril President and Chief Strategy Officer Christian Brose to discuss transatlantic defense innovation. So thank you all so much for being with us today. We're looking forward to a terrific set of discussions. And with that, it's my pleasure to turn things over now to Ambassador Allen.
Thank you very much, Vice President Walker, and thank you very much, Dr. Polyakova, for once again organizing this event together with us here at the Embassy of Sweden. It's a great pleasure for you and us to be in this wonderful room, right? Yes. It's really a pleasure for us at the Embassy to do this event together with CEPA. We think it's very timely, and we think it's actually a pretty good idea to be at the Swedish Embassy, because after all, if you looked at the annual review that the World Intellectual Property Organization published a couple of weeks ago, Switzerland was number 1 when it comes to innovation, Sweden was number 2, and US, I'm sorry to say, was number 3. And as you know, Silicon Valley is a great scene for startups and unicorns, but the second best place in the world with unicorns and startups is actually Stockholm. So there is no wonder that we really love to have this cooperation together with CEPA in highlighting the need for a transatlantic relationship when it comes to tech and security. Sweden is not only having a lot of tech companies, we also have a very strong industry. And I think it's important to say that, because sometimes when we talk about the service industry, we think it is just a service industry. But the reality is, if you don't have an industry to service, you don't have a service industry. And I'm very happy to represent a country that both have a strong tech sector, but also a very strong industrial base. And since I am the Swedish ambassador, I'm allowed to brag a little bit about the relationship between Sweden and the United States. And I think it may come as a surprise for many of you that a country of 10.5 million people in Sweden is number 9 in investing into the American economy. We actually passed Australia this year. And I think that's pretty good for a country of 10.5 million to be number 9. 380,000 Americans are directly employed by a Swedish company. So no wonder why we want to support CEPA, because we think and we strongly believe that the future is in a better relationship over the Atlantic. If we're going to manage the challenges we see ahead when it comes to tech, security, we really believe that there must be a strong bond between the United States and Europe. So this conference is very timely. We are very happy that you have chosen to work with us again, and I wish you all the best for this conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. No better man to big up Swedish achievements here in the US. I think you're lagging Ireland in some of those statistics as well, but we can come back to that later. I'm going to welcome our first panel on stage, if I may. First up, we're going to Glenn Parham, who is the founder. Go ahead. All come up at the same time, lads. Don't have to wait. Glenn Parham is the founder of GovBench, and he is formerly at the DOW Pentagon. We're going to go Pentagon for today. We've got Craig Singleton, who is joining us as a China expert for the defense of democracies. You can give your association, your organization, its full name for us, Craig, when you're starting. Jim Lewis, who is a distinguished fellow with CEPA. Yeah, distinguished. Who, I'm sure you're all here today to hear from. And Ari Giovenko, who is head of trade policy here for Amazon. So I'll say thank you very much to everyone for joining us on stage. Thank you. If there is any confusion, I'm Ronan Murphy, by the way. I'm the tech policy director. And if you need to distinguish me from the other panelists, I'm the one without the facial hair. Okay? So soak that up. I'm going to start with you, Glenn, as the most recent exeter we have available here from working in government here. And we've framed a panel here to discuss, how AI development, regulation, everything that goes within the stack impacts geopolitical dynamics, and vice versa, because it's hard to distinguish between those. Could you maybe tee up for us a bit how you see who's best positioned to control the future of AI stacks, why, and maybe frame that in the context of what you're up to today?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me here today. Great weather. It's a beautiful view. Oh my God. I left the Pentagon, Department of War, Department of Defense, whatever you want to call it, a few months ago, and there I led a generative AI from the Office of Secretary of Defense. Was also in charge of AI infrastructure, and there's a lot of bottlenecks when it comes to things that we call the AI stack, or I don't know if we like that term, AI stack, AI infrastructure, from compute GPUs to the data centers, things of that nature. But something I've been thinking about a lot in terms of who's going to own, and really be dominant in this space. It's really contingent on the AI talent. It's kind of shocking how it's literally a few dozen of the best AI scientists in the world that this is all propped up on, in the dozens across the AI labs. And I think what's been fascinating is over the past couple of months, you may have seen in the headlines, a lot of AI scientists were tried to be lured over to other AI labs to the tune of billions of dollars in compensation packages. And a lot of them didn't move. They're motivated by something other than money in a lot of cases. It's mission, it's culture, it's where they see this all headed. And so I think it's been fascinating because it's in that sense, money isn't necessarily the primary motivator anymore. We can throw money at compute, we can throw money at data centers. We can't easily change the culture or the values of a nation or of allied nations. And so I think as we look into the future about who is going to really be dominant here, it's going to be contingent on where these few dozen AI scientists, the best and the brightest from all over the world, where they concert all of their efforts.
Okay, thanks very much, Glenn. Money is no longer the motivator, but interesting, I'll say. I turn to you next, Jim. We briefly touched upon it. I think Glenn alluded to it here. I mean, we've hit a lot of buzzwords with the title of this panel. So we've got AI evolution, we've got geopolitical, we've got AI stack. Have we got a lexicon? Have we got a language to? Are we talking across each other? And maybe how does that fit in the geopolitical framing today? Is there a language we can use? Should we be using different words? How do you see that scene?
I thought you were going to ask me an easy question.
Well, that's why we brought you. That's what we paid the big bucks for.
Is
Yeah.
it working? Yeah, there we go. Okay, good. So we were discussing this before we came up. Where are we in the hype cycle? Because this is a hype cycle for AI, but that obscures the fact that this is a real change. It may not be as dramatic, and of course the precedent is the dot-com bubble, where you had a huge amount of investment that then blew up. That's not necessarily bad, because the investment, the infrastructure, the networks that are built will provide goods to the broader society, even if the individual investors first go bankrupt. And there's good there's good evidence for that. So it may not be cheery for those of you who have stock in some AI companies, but I think that what we're struggling with, and there's some discussion, what do you want to call this? I settled on fourth industrial revolution, right? As the change that, if you think steam engine or aircraft or any of the earlier precedents, this will reshape economies, and with it, it will reshape national power, right? And the elements are what we're going to talk about in the AI stack. It's the infrastructure, it's the digital infrastructure, it's the cables, it's the internet, it's the hardware that goes into AI, mainly GPUs, but other stuff as well. It's data centers, and if you map data centers, you get an idea of where economic power will be in the future. So we're at the cusp of this dramatic change. It will take years to play out, right? It's already started. It's not going to be. How many people in the room believe in Terminator? Come on, there's got good. We got 1, 2, yeah, 3, 4. Really?
When you say believe,
Well, yeah,
you
what does
mean
believe mean?
we're all going to fall victim to the
Yeah, I was at
big sky or whatever it's called.
I was at an event on AI recently where the discussion was not when would the end of the human race occur because of superintelligence, but was it 2 years away, 5 years away? None of the estimates were under 10 years. It's not going to happen, right? What is going to happen is how you do business, how you create wealth. That will change, and so that's where focusing on the stack, which is the parts of the new industrial framework, new economic framework, is important.
Thanks, Jim. So, Craig, I might turn to you next. Your particular area of expertise, and the reason we brought you here is because you're following what's going on in China in particular, doing so with the Foundation for Defense of Democracy. So excuse me if I garbled that earlier. But how do you see how China is approaching this? Because the stack includes, as Jim has alluded to, infrastructure, things that are going to be used, physical things, software, data, and so on. But there's a governance layer on top. There's more to it than that. So how is China approaching it, and what are the implications for everybody else at this point?
No,
Small question.
Yeah, smaller. No, thanks for having me here. It's great. I agree with Jim. Definitions matter and words matter. The Chinese are masters at this. China's approach to building this stack, as we're trying to define it, isn't modular, it's total. I think it's important that when we refer to what the PRC is pursuing, we kind of refer to it as like an authoritarian tech stack. It is distinct, it is different. They want to fuse data with compute and ideology, and you can't separate these three from where they are sort of going. They have a very vertically integrated approach, and it's everything from chip design to manufacturing, but overlaying all of that is Chinese Communist Party governance. For them, though, it's not just about capability, it is about control, and I think this is very important that we start talking about this. They don't hide this. They treat AI, and are starting to talk about AI, as it's like an instrument of political power. It's a tool for social management, and then a distant third is economic productivity. in how they describe it in their discourse. I would argue that the way we're talking about in the West is very, very different. China's model is spreading, but our lead is still, I think, very well protected, both at the frontier, but also sort of in how it's being institutionalized and operationalized. But the way the Chinese are pursuing it is different. And they're focusing on things like data partnerships, infrastructure exports that will be piggybacking AI, and then digital surveillance. That's a very different model than I think Western companies are sort of pursuing as they think about advantage. The risk for all the transatlantic partnership, though, I don't think is about technical lag. Again, I think we're really far ahead. It's actually on normative displacement. I think that's where we are at risk right now because the rules are being written. And I think the challenge is that if China sets these standards, and they're pursuing them quite aggressively in multilateral fora, but also the ITU in particular and the UN, but more broadly, then I think what they'll control is how AI is governed, and you shape the rules. And so you're going to shape the game. And I think that's sort of the part of the conversation that we find ourselves at today as we're thinking about how do you operationalize this? How can companies use it? What are the end use cases? Who are the users? The challenge, though, is, right, the contest isn't necessarily, in my view, who builds AI faster. It's whose values get hard-coded into the system. And that is probably the defining challenge, I think, for transatlantic partners today.
So when you say normative displacement, give us a real-world example, if you can, of what you mean by that.
So I think the Chinese do this very well at the UN, but Belt and Road Initiative has been mainlined into lots of multilateral documents that drive decision-making norms and values across countries, across regions. Xi Jinping thought and elements of Xi Jinping thought, aspects of how China pursues cyber dominance and cyber sovereignty. Those words matter when we're debating things like cyber world treaties, which are currently underway at the UN, right? Yeah. So if the rules reflect China's values and interests, they can gain mass adoption, even if the primary drivers and markets are in the West. We have to start thinking about what does global scale and adoption look like. And this is very much a war that's not fought in battlefields. It's fought with commas and semicolons on paper.
Commas and semicolons, the weapons of choice. Okay.
Good old throw an M dash in there.
An M dash, yes, yeah. The DIO or CD, these phrases, you have to be a certain age to remember what those meant, but there was a time when that's how you found documents on your PC. It wasn't even called it then. Ari, you're not in the PC business, but Amazon they're in technology, to be sure.
We sell PCs.
You sell PCs, good to know. And you're a global company doing business throughout the world. That's what global generally means. And particularly, you're a big player in Europe on a lot of fronts. And that's part of the reason we brought you here today and we bring people to events all the time, is because we're always looking for those who are involved in the transatlantic relationship in some shape or form that's significant and can tell us more about it and how it can improve and so on. And thanks for bringing that up as well, Craig. So the first-hand experience that Amazon has on regulation, which is a governance layer at the top of this stack potentially, and there's no denying you're in it in other places, for sure. How does that impact thinking? How does all of this impact what Amazon does and how it decides to do things? And what lessons can be learned for cooperation and pitfalls to avoid, that sort of thing?
Well, perfect. Well, first, thank you, Ronan. Thank you, CEPA, Alina. Terrific to be here. Great panel and great event overall. As you said, Ronan, we do have a first-hand view of the digital regulatory environment and how that is affecting the deployment of AI. Obviously, not a surprise to anyone in this room. There's a slate of digital regulations coming out of Europe, whether that's the DMA, the DSA, the EU AI Act, EU CS, EU Space Act. I've probably left off a few, but there's a number of policies that we're having to operate in within this larger AI environment. And evidence is building that these overlapping regulations are likely going to have a relatively significant impact on the deployment of how companies and consumers across Europe and broadly around the world will be able to use AI to transform business, their lives, and many other facets of what they do every day. So, there's a consensus building with some that really a simplification agenda, and you see it with Mr. Draghi and others, is really going to be important as we're looking at competitiveness in the future in Europe, but also the transatlantic relationship, global dynamics on these issues. So what are we seeing? I think it's important to kind of identify some of the data points of what's happening. And right now in Europe, 40% of businesses are saying, 40% of EU businesses' tech spend is going towards compliance, and that only goes up when you look at startups who have it at 45%. Something like the DMA, recent research has showed there's going to be a $98 billion cost for compliance, lost revenue fines, mostly shouldered on US companies. But how's that going to impact AI deployment? 31% of SMEs cite these implementation costs of regulation as a factor in how they're going to adopt new technology. EU businesses are of course also facing delays in the deployment of AI tools and services, and companies are postponing the launch of services. And I think really important to remember, AI is about efficiency for businesses, and as larger businesses are not able to access those tools and services, that knock-on effect to the larger economy across Europe, I mean, it gets straight back to that competitiveness conversation. So, really, as we're looking at this, we're seeing, the defects of these regulations, which, are a one-size-fits-all approach that don't really work in the age of AI, where the use cases for the technology are somewhat endless, some would argue. But it's broadly hampering innovation and adoption, and really, as the patchwork of regulations, the potential just becomes less and less, and I think we end up moving towards a system that looks more like a kind of two-tiered AI system that, again, will have broader issues related to the broader economy. So what do we think is the right approach? Obviously, an environment that enables innovation, focuses on safety and competition, risk-based, should really clearly define what we're talking about when it comes to high risk. And again, shouldn't be one size fits all. Should be a democratic approach, interoperable, and really avoid that fragmentation that we see. So we're optimistic that something like the US-EU joint statement and whatever follows can potentially unlock some of these issues. And obviously, there's other dynamics around the G7, the Hiroshima process, et cetera, where I do think some really good work can happen here. And we're looking forward to engaging there.
Yeah, so you pointed to some areas where there is potential cooperation. I think coming back along the line, Jim, I've heard you say, because this is a point of contention, and when we're trying to deal in transatlantic cooperation and finding areas for cooperation, regulation comes up, to be sure. And a part of the European position is that there's a misunderstanding about what the EU is trying to achieve. But you might contend, don't want to put words in your mouth, but that it's not about misunderstanding, it's just that much of the US does not agree with what the EU is trying to achieve with these regulations. And the long-term, the impact that has on what we're talking about here, that divergence.
One of the problems in talking about technology is you have to agree on a set of metrics that are more precise or less disputable than other metrics. And so my favorite big metric is GDP. Is your GDP going up or down? There's many factors that go into national income, but technology is one of them. How many unicorns do you have? Israel and Europe have about the same number of unicorns, right? How many startups do you have? What's the investment flow? What is your market share? These are the questions, and these are the questions the Chinese ask themselves too. So we have to ask ourselves, how do we know a policy is working, right? And just as an aside, on Monday, boy, it's been a long week. On Monday, I talked to a small northern European country that is not part of the European Union. And they've taken, their question was, how do I cooperate with the Europeans? Because we've taken a different approach to regulation. Ours is sector-based. You know, the banking sector has one set of problems. The health sector has another set of problems. And it's actually worked quite well for them in that they're one of the leading centers of AI development in the world now, right? So Europe could, if it kind of rethought what it did, be a little more effective. I mean, there are problems, and one of the, I think, bigger cultural issues is the experiences of the 20th century have made Europe and a fair portion of the US population cautious, timid, afraid of technology. And you can make a good case that it's worrisome, right? But that's not the way to get economic growth. And since one of the things we're talking about is how do you compete with China? The Chinese, or at least their leaders, are not burdened with this, right? So they're not going to worry about something bad happening. They're going to look at it. Their metrics are a little different than ours, but some of the same. GDP, market share, who controls the infrastructure. By the way, Huawei won the last round, right? I was part of the struggle against them, and so I can freely say we didn't do so well. So that's, I think, what's going on is we have, if we can settle on the right set of metrics. And one thing I'll finish with this, that I think it's peculiar sometimes that sometimes when you talk to European officials, they dispute the numbers, right? Or they say, well, just wait. When I started doing this stuff, Europe had a tech industry. Its regulations killed it, right? I find that conclusive, but some don't. So we have a strategic problem as the US is how do we get Europe to rebuild its tech sector and compete with us, but also compete with China.
Craig, that tees up nicely. I mean, this divergence between the US and EU approach to regulation, which has happened over quite a period of time. It's not recent. How can we find those areas of cooperation in the stack in whatever definition the fourth industrial revolution, detente, whatever? Let's find it. How can we progress that?
Yeah, sure. I like fourth industrial revolution. It's stealing fourth revolution from the Chinese. A Liz economy might come for you to get some copyright money for that. But
we'll protect you, Jim.
Yeah, I think right now, like the transatlantic conversation seems like it's going in two different tracks. I agree. I share a lot of pessimism about whether Europe is capable of becoming an AI superpower. I don't really think it factors much. This focus on privacy and on ethics is very distinct from the conversation here in DC, which is, I think, primarily just on export controls and slowing the Chinese down, speeding up. I think there's a big challenge on whether you can merge this transatlantic conversation into a single strategy. Again, I'm very, very pessimistic on Europe's playing a big role in that, though. I think Jim made a good point earlier about there are a few areas where we could collaborate better. One, I do think, is on the hardware front. I do think there's opportunities in things like joint investments in chips and lithography and compute. I think there's opportunity space there. And we certainly can't let the Chinese get into that space in Europe, although they're making massive inroads in lots of areas in Europe. I think common export controls that are forward-looking is an area where the two governments and sort of the two sides need to quickly get on the same page. These should not be reactive lists. And if folks were watching today and saw what the Chinese announced on export controls globally on rare earths and magnets, that should be a big wake-up call to the Europeans that they need to advance and align quickly with the United States. But there needs to be, I think, a shared criteria for what counts as strategic technology. And that conversation is an important one. Again, it gets to definitions and rules. We don't have anything that remotely mirrors like an AI assurance framework between the transatlantic partners. Nothing like that exists. Trusted pathways for data.
Yeah, but that's important. It's a start.
It's a start, right? Model validation. Things that can cross borders. I mean, we have to get there, and those conversations need to pick up fast. And I do think there are probably opportunities to align industrial incentives a lot better.
So the CHIPS Act sort of territory? Or
Well, I think there's probably opportunities to pool money. Allied scale is real. I encourage folks to follow a good friend of mine, Rush Doshi, who's writing on this. But Allied scale, he is primarily writing about it within the context of Indo-Pacific partners.
Okay.
Again, if Europe doesn't want, they have to get in the game. Otherwise, they're going to cede all this ground to the Japanese and the Australians, and I think the Koreans. And so I think thinking about shared industrial incentives could be powerful when you think about things like building an innovation ecosystem somewhere. What does that look like? We're doing that with other partners, and we're doing that here, and the Europeans are not, frankly, a factor in those conversations. Joint labs, shared compute, these are all areas where I think we should be better aligned. We talked about, right, in the defense construct about interoperability in the defense domain, but we do not talk about it in the tech domain. That's got to change fast. Otherwise, I suspect this conversation will just increasingly be centered around two poles, China and the US, and it's not clear whether the Europeans are frankly going to factor. Right?
Yeah, and thank you for teeing up interoperability. CEPA recently published a report, a joint offering between our program, Tech Policy, and Transatlantic Defence and Security about exactly that within the NATO alliance. Basically for exchange of data, keeping it that basic. But we mentioned NATO, and you mentioned opportunities for investment, cooperation, spending, shared pool. That 5%, the increase, the 1.5% that is not labelled for military use specifically, there's an opportunity there, to be sure.
Huge untapped potential.
Yeah.
Shape and direct that money well. I think we can actually do industrial policy better than the Chinese, which they throw a lot of money at this problem, and they've made some gains, but not as many as I think they would like us all to believe. I actually think that capitalism and Western markets are more resilient and durable and can be more efficient. We should be pooling our resources.
Yeah, and look, as the European sitting up here, we're not going to just engage in Euro bashing here. I refuse to allow it. Because it's interesting, there's some convergence. You're using the phrase industrial policy. It's been used in town here. That was a European thing, and that was not, that was anathema. It's entrepreneurship, that's what we want to support in the US. And now it's up and running. It's a thing. Everyone's up, It's
a little bit of a four-letter word under this administration. You're not going to see a new CHIPS Act.
Yeah.
And they're clawing back CHIPS Act money. They're talking about American dynamism, private sector investments driving it. So I think
different tools, but the same.
Sure, but the overindulgence of the CHIPS Act and the size and the scale and where the money went and what was the ROI, I think is actually shifted here. So I don't think I think it will be primarily private sector and private capital driven. The government is not going to, I think, be doing another CHIPS Act. I have a hard time believing that under the current.
So Jim, you want to get in there? Yeah. Thanks, Craig.
And we are bashing Europe a little bit in part because we're sort of annoyed, but there are strong centers of innovation in AI and in technology in Europe. We heard about Sweden. You could point at Switzerland. You could point at other Baltic countries, other Nordic countries. The UK, although they're not part of the EU, there's many strong European countries, the Dutch, there's many strong European innovators. The question is, why is the sum less than the total of the parts? And so that's what we ought to think about is and I'll say it again, it's a major strategic problem. The rise of China is a major strategic problem for the US. The dilemmas of Europe is a major strategic problem for the US, and it would help us if we could figure out how to strengthen the European tech sector.
Is this something that you would have discussed, Glenn? You're dealing with generative AI in a military context, dual use context. We're talking about NATO funding, and we're talking about the bleed between tech and defense, basically. How did you approach that seeking cooperation on infrastructure? And was it a topic? Is this geopolitical study stacks hovering over your head at all times?
Yeah, I think while I was in the Pentagon, it's difficult because you have all these kind of top-down policies that are emerging, right? Like, we have to abide by responsible AI tenets. That was in the last administration, different executive orders around that. Now there's an anti-woke executive order that the administration is requiring all the AI labs comply with when they're procuring stuff on the government side. My frustration or problem was I'm an engineer, so I look at these policies and I'm like, okay, how do I actually implement this into the AI that we're we're building, the different applications. Saying it can't be anti-discriminatory or should be anti-discriminatory is not enough. I need metrics, going back to the idea of relevant metrics. And so what I've been able to do on my way out of the Pentagon and currently is really focus in on creating these relevant benchmarks that are relevant to government domains, more specifically the military domain, where we can actually point to numbers and be like, hey, when it comes to supply chain optimization tasks in the South China Sea, OpenAI's model gets 30x% on whatever different tasks. And it's been interesting because I worked with NATO while I was in the Pentagon, did some pilots and whatnot. But on my way out, they've been like very hungry for these benchmarks because they don't have any of themselves. There typically are more resources on this side of the equation for us to build out these benchmarks. And so I think that's been a surprising actual vehicle of being constructive with our allies, where we can actually come up with something that can really streamline adoption in the military context and other government contexts as well. And I think that we need to invest more in this. I know that there's kind of a restructuring within the Department of Commerce, or the NIST, the CASE, the Center for AI Safety or Security, or whatever the rebrand is now. I think that's a great start, but benchmarks are pretty much going to be the only way, as all the AI labs now have contracts with the Pentagon, for us to be able to say, okay, these models can be used beyond rewriting a poem. They can actually be used in various military domains with lethal or high consequences.
Okay, rewriting poetry, good. Yeah, we'd love to see that. I think another buzzword that definitely roams around in this particular part of the woods is sovereignty. We could discuss AI sovereignty, but it goes a bit beyond that because it underpins foreign affairs, whatever way you want to put it, nationhood. Ari, I'm not going to ask you about nationhood too much, but the digital sovereignty agenda within Europe must be something that's in your wheelhouse at the moment, whether you like it or not. And to a degree, there's a US position, not more than a degree, there's a US position on sovereignty and US dominance, US first. How are you managing that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we see that true digital sovereignty comes from kind of building strong, innovative ecosystems with the robust controls, but they shouldn't be isolated. They shouldn't be a means for protectionism. So obviously, we support resilience and what's needed in critical sectors, but even the EU's competitiveness compass, which I think was referenced in the handout that you guys put on seats, it talks about failure of integrating tech. It could really lead to Europe falling behind, and I think it's good to remember 70% of new economic activity in Europe is digitally based. So, really, as these conversations of decoupling and whatever you want to call it come up, the cost to Europe would be 1.1 billion euros, and for U.S. We're contributing 1 trillion euros to the European economy as technology companies. So artificial barriers that come up in the sovereignty conversation, we believe significantly hurt the ability to really enhance the growth of technology. And we have some great successful examples across Europe. We're working with governments across Europe. We're also working with top companies like Mistral AI. We've launched our sovereign cloud with AWS in Europe, but we're still seeing that the remnants of the EUCS cloud cybersecurity proposal are out there. But even in new spaces like space, we see the EU Space Act, and as Amazon is deploying satellites for Project Kuiper, we're seeing proposals like the EU Space Act basically come up with new criteria that are very specifically crafted to hit a quote giga constellation, which really is only going to impact companies with a certain number of satellites, and just so happens to be the few U.S. companies with that number of satellites. So I think it's just really important that these broad regulatory frameworks are simple and adaptable to new technology, and really there's a consistency across countries to ensure that, again, back to our AI conversation, we're really able to promote the adoption and rollout of AI. And what does that mean kind of on the transatlantic piece, non-discrimination, core, and I think that really, we're hopeful that there's going to be productive dialogues. I know others are less confident on the panel, but I think really important that in this tech sovereignty conversation, we're really avoiding escalations and kind of harmful ideas of retaliation, et cetera. And I think that should be a core focus.
Is sovereignty the stone in the shoe here that's going to prevent immediate progress? Can it be overcome? Anyone, Jim?
Well, I'll start. So we've emerged from the one world era, and you can get Francis Fukuyama's book at a discount. You have to go on YouTube and search for Coke commercials saying I'd like to teach the world blah blah blah. Right? We're over the one world, and it was a very American world. It wasn't necessarily DC, but it was New York and Los Angeles. And so there's been a resurgence of sovereignty. This has been coming for a while. You saw it originally on internet governance. Do I have to play by the rules that Americans made up, the American private sector made up? And the answer of most countries was no. Now, the dilemma with this is there's a cost and there's a benefit to having interconnections globally. So my sense is politically, we're just going to have to get through this period of sovereignty. Eventually, someone will figure out it costs more than it's worth. There's got to be a new model, though. It's not going to be the millennial visions that were at the basis of the internet in the 1990s. But what that new vision is, we have not yet defined.
Well, the danger, I suppose that opens up the danger if we don't define it, someone else is going to do it for us. Is that it, Craig? Is that the bottom line?
Absolutely. We have to show that democracies can out-innovate and scale and deploy faster without sacrificing trust. That is the debate. The Chinese.
Does it have to be democracies?
I think
Is that practical?
I think it is probably where the allied scale content is most powerful. Just adding up the GDP good factor of, I think, measurement, add it all up and compare it to China. These are leaps and bounds ahead of where the Chinese are. So again, like if the democracies have some semblance of shared values and can have these joint innovation ecosystems and can get on the same page, hopefully about the value of trust, which we both led I think, moderately successful Huawei campaign, by the way. Huawei is not the same company today that it was, and there's certainly major dents in do you trust Huawei, and I don't know a single person that hears the word Huawei and thinks trust. So if we're talking about a trusted stack, then we're talking about a rhetorical conversation amongst democracies about what our values are and what our interests are, and being very clear-cut of where they diverge with the Chinese. So I think that's where there is value in democratic scale. But the question is, we have to show that trusted AI is not slower AI. And I think that's sort of where I think that's where America is very much ahead right now. It would be a shame if Europe isn't a part of that conversation.
So you do think the gap is still significant, that the US is that far ahead?
I think our lead is very sizable.
Okay.
Not just in chip development, but advanced chips, and I think where the models are, I think we're far and away ahead. Tool development, I think there are some key factors where the Chinese are closing the gap and getting there, but it's a lot more rhetoric than reach.
Yeah. Okay. So look, we're coming up on time here for the panel. So look, we've covered a fair amount of ground there, and thank you very much for doing that. I'm putting you on the spot a little bit, but if we could get some way specific, and it can be from your own world, it could be very narrow, that's fine. But Chris mentioned it, you mentioned it was on, I think Ari, you mentioned it, the Tech 2030 paper, I'm sure. I hope everyone got a copy who's here. We're trying to find areas where cooperation is possible transatlantic now, leaping past maybe things that are just not going to change in the next few weeks. There's no point pretending. DMA is going to exist, Digital Markets Act is going to exist in Europe, for instance, and that's just a fact. So if you could pick, where could we start? Give us one item, practical item, or can be bigger picture, that would be a good starting point for this.
I would say, sorry, I'm going to say two things. One, those benchmarks are very critical. When you work in government, you have to go through lengthy processes to test and evaluate these models. So if we have things to point to, that'll hugely streamline that process. And then I also think, open source or open weight models, that is such an important role in how we're able to distribute these models across a lot of different domains. And if you look at the frontier labs, OpenAI, Anthropic, great models, but when it comes to highly regulated industries, it's pretty difficult to bring them into these environments, although they are making progress. Open source models are the first things to be adopted in pretty much every highly regulated industry. And so I would say Europe is, with Mistral, has been doing a lot of great work in terms of publishing these open weight models. Meta is the counterpart, I would say, in the US. And I think that is probably, I don't want to lose steam there. I think that is likely going to be the most important, model family over the next couple of years. I mean, who's to say maybe this time next year, open source models are ahead of most of the closed source ones. So,
Yep, it's an actual technical suggestion. Craig?
When I talked to American AI CEOs, they cannot articulate what Europe's role is in this conversation, what you bring to the table. I don't know what that is either. Is it going to be talent and workforce? Then you better start making investments and show that you're going to do it and make those investments. Is it going to be data centers? Is it going to be hardware? I think increasingly the American companies think we're just going to have to, Europe is a hindrance, they're not a help. They're either going to have to bring something to the table or they're going to be left behind. And I think it's incumbent upon Europe to articulate what is your value proposition. What are you adding to the value chain? That has not been articulated at all. If Europe can get its act together and its messaging together and figure out where it wants to make those strategic investments across this full stack, great. I think America would welcome that conversation, but that's not clear. And I don't hear Europe come up, frankly, ever in my conversations with the biggest AI companies in the United States. They only talk about China and the China competition. Answer that question, and I think Europe has a card to play.
So, is it Europe has a communication problem? And it is a giant market. It's a talent hub. It's potentially lucrative in the long run. But is it not a little bit short-sighted of those CEOs to ignore Europe in that way and not see it in other ways? No.
I don't know if they would think it's short-sighted. I think it potentially is short-sighted because it cuts into the allied scale we need.
Yeah, but
to
that's
scale,
the thing. It
to
gives that
scale,
depth.
deploy, break in talent. I think, again, Indo-Pacific partners, where I focus most of my time, are far ahead of European partners in this conversation and aligning resources and policies to defined objectives in this space. Europe is very far behind. What does Europe bring to the table? If they can answer that question, whether it's on an individual country basis or as the huge market that it is, then I think you get a seat at the table. You get to be a big part of that conversation. You can influence outcomes. I don't see that happening today. I think that would be it would be a very compelling case to prove otherwise.
Okay, thank you very much, Craig. Jim?
So we tried scaring the Europeans, and it kind of worked with Huawei. I mean, no one trusts Huawei anymore. I don't know if the same tactic will work for AI though, or for what I'm going to still call the fourth industrial revolution with automation, and which came out of Europe, by the way, at least the last couple iterations. So Europe has a strong, if you think of the elements of an innovation base, Europe is strong in many areas. The place where they fall short is governance, right? And we can help with that. I think, former diplomat, full transparency, we probably need some sort of formal dialogue with the Europeans. Trade negotiations are different from what they were 50 years ago. TTC never really got off the ground, or if it got off the ground, it was pointed in the wrong direction. We're going to have to sit down and have a long process of getting common understandings with Europe on risk and on growth. And that's what I'd say is we can probably do this. We have not done it, and we probably should.
So much has happened in trade that TTC feels sort of nostalgic at this point. but yeah, I think dialogue would be fantastic.
We're not missing it.
Yeah.
I think one piece of unlocking the stack, I think, is connectivity. And I already mentioned it, but I think internet connectivity, satellite, Project Kuiper, low Earth orbit satellites, incredibly important for the future. And we're excited by what's to come on it.
I love it, Ari. On message. I love it. Bonus for you. Bonus for you. Listen, ladies and gentlemen, let's thank our panel here. Ari, Jim, Greg, and Glenn. Thank you very much. Folks, we had an awards dinner last night. It was fantastic. And one of the awards that we have given was to the Prime Minister of Sweden. So it's appropriate that we're here. And I'm looking down at a prominent Swede here, Paul. Thank you very much. Yeah, Prime Minister Ulf Kristersson, am I pronouncing that correctly? Great. Received an award from us. And we managed to get a video with him. And I think we have that teed up now for playing. Yes, roll VT. Thank you.
Thank you. It is a true honor to be recognized here tonight and to send you this greeting from Stockholm. This award is an acknowledgement of the collective journey that Sweden has embarked on as a new member of NATO. After more than 200 years of military non-alignment, this is a big step, but at the same time, a very natural step. Sweden's commitment to NATO and to transatlantic cooperation is not merely a strategic choice, it is a declaration of who we are and what we stand for. Freedom, democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. We are committed to upholding the rules-based international order whenever it is challenged. And we will always stand up for every nation's right to choose its own security arrangements. We support Ukraine's right for territorial integrity, not only because it is right, but because it is necessary. A free and sovereign Ukraine is essential to the stability of Europe. We contribute actively to NATO's deterrence and defense through joint exercises, strategic planning, and forward deployments, because security is not given, it is built together. We are backing this commitment with real resources. Today, Sweden exceeds NATO's minimum requirements for defense and spending, and we will continue to raise our ambitions with the aim to reach NATO's 5% goal already in 2030. It all comes down to priorities. We can afford to defend our freedom, but we cannot afford to lose it. If there is one thing we should recall from the Cold War, it is this: we won, dictatorship lost. There is no natural law ensuring that it will always be so, but the free world has done it before, and we can and we will do it again. Sweden will remain a reliable, principled and forward-looking partner in the transatlantic community. We will lead with conviction, act with integrity, and stand shoulder to shoulder with our allies for a free, secure and democratic world. Once again, thank you so much.
You okay to do it? Okay, Andy Williams it is. Delighted to introduce an Air Force veteran, an engineer, an entrepreneur, an educator. Please allow, give a warm round of applause to bring to stage the representative for U.S. House of Representatives, Pennsylvania 6th, the Honourable Chrissy Houlihan. Thank you, Chrissy. We'll be talking about biotech.
Thank you. Can you guys hear me? Is this on? Okay, great. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for being here today on what is probably one of the most beautiful days that we've had in a long time. Thank you for spending this time inside with me, and thank you very much for being here, even though right now our government is shut down. I'm still here, so I'm glad that you're still here too. And thank you very much to the Center for hosting this really important event. As mentioned, my name is Chrissy Houlihan. I come from just up the road a little bit, right next to the great city of brotherly love, Philadelphia. I have the honor of representing Pennsylvania's 6th Congressional District, which is due west of the city of Philadelphia. And as mentioned, before coming to Congress, I served in the United States Air Force, built a career as an engineer and entrepreneur, and I also even taught high school chemistry. So I tend to look at the world in a peculiar way, both scientific and also service-oriented. And as a member of Congress, I also come to you as one of the very few, less than a few dozen, members of Congress who have a STEM or STEAM background. And that's, I think, important, an important distinction, and unfortunately, one that I wish we had more people who had STEM and STEAM background. But it's really nice to be here to talk to you about a really important STEM and STEAM is science, technology, engineering, and math. And the A sometimes refers to the arts as well. I saw some questions in the audience, and so having a background in technology, basically. We're going to be talking about biotechnology, and we're also going to be talking about it in the context of our transatlantic partnership and the future. So we'll start by level setting a little bit and ask kind of what are we talking about when we're talking about emerging biotechnology. Many of us who are in the room are of a certain age, and maybe the last time that we took biology was maybe in the 70s or the 80s. Biology has changed a great deal since many of us were in school. But in short, the tools and techniques and the platforms that allow us to take advantage of biology haven't changed a whole lot. We've been doing this for centuries. When we think about something as basic as brewing beer, we're talking about the basic building blocks of biology and biotechnology. When we put yeast and grain into a big vat, the yeast consumes the sugar and the grain, and it comes out as beer, happily for many of us. And Ben Franklin is famous for saying that, something about beer and happiness and God, as I recall. So now if we just fast forward to modern times and we imagine that we're replacing that yeast with engineered cells instead, and those cells are designed to produce something that's entirely new, not just beer, but maybe medicine or sustainable fuels or advanced materials like Kevlar for protecting our troops, or even component materials for things like batteries. So that, in essence, is the modern version of biotechnology and biomanufacturing. So let me offer you a couple of real-world examples as well. I'll start first with mushrooms, and mushrooms sounds like a weird place to start with, but if you're from Pennsylvania's 6th Congressional District, we are the mushroom capital of the world. We grow 60% of the country's mushrooms, and so you can thank us at Thanksgiving when you're gathered around your family table. But we take our mushrooms really seriously in Pennsylvania. Imagine not just being able to put them on your pizza, but rather imagine engineering fungal systems, not just for food, but for biofabricated materials, biodegradable packing, or concrete-like substances that could change how we build our roads, our bridges, our tunnels, and our infrastructure. And that's actually not science fiction. Indeed, it's emerging biotechnology that exists today. Second, perhaps consider our unfortunate dependence on China for critical minerals, including rare earths and battery metals or semiconductor inputs. Biotechnology offers us alternative pathways like biomining, which would use microbes that would extend metals from low-grade ores to reduce reliance on fragile and adversarial supply chains. So basically, biotechnology could replace our reliance on China for things like critical minerals and rare earth elements. So as someone who's spent a lot of her time on supply chain management, I see huge opportunity here to strengthen both our economy, but also our nations and national security across the world, across allied countries, such as the ones that embody each one of us here in this room. So I very much believe that we are firmly in the right place to begin to transform how we do things, how we heal disease, how we grow food, how we make sustainable materials, how we clean up pollution, and even how we secure supply chains. But the challenge that's before us is making sure that the United States and Europe are in the lead in these transformations, and that we are in the lead that in a way that is consistent with our shared values and our shared democratic ideals. Make no mistake, however, this is not just an academic or economic competition between the United States and our allies and the rest of the world. China is making biotechnology a very much of a strategic national priority. They're investing incredibly heavily over the past decades, and they are absolutely blurring those lines between what is commercially viable and what is a military application for that. I had the chance to go to China about 2 weeks ago, and I can affirm that they are working very aggressively. In fact, I think they're on their 15th round of planning for biology in terms of long-term planning, and that's a pretty scary thing when you think of a country that's savvy enough and smart enough to have taken 15 different stabs at what their biotech map looks like. So that's the worrisome news, but the good news is we in the United States have been thinking about this for the last decades, hopefully, and specifically for the government for the last several years. We initiated a National Security Commission that was on emerging biotechnology, and the other good news is that this was a bipartisan and bicameral panel. So both the House and the Senate, both Democrats and Republicans, if you can believe it, for a certain amount of time were able to put themselves together, collect themselves to work together and create a report that was issued April 2025. It took 3 years in the making, and the report is now out. And the good news is that it basically says that if we work aggressively and swiftly, we can continue to be competitive in this emerging biotech field. But we really have enormous stakes, and we need to make sure we're doing it rapidly. The economic power, health and security, and geopolitical future of all of us is at stake. And that's why we're here, and I'm here talking to you right now about the United States and European collaboration that is so essential to be happening now if it's not already happening in the past. We have to be aligned. We have to be interoperable. We have to be mutually reinforcing one another to make sure that we're not duplicating efforts, and to also make sure, frankly, that we're not diverging in our efforts as well. And I'll be really honest with you. I come to you as, put up your hand if you think I'm a Democrat. Okay, half of you. Put up your hand if you think I'm a Republican. Some of you. I'm a Democrat. You know, I come to you in a purple place. My community is 40% Democrat, 40% Republican, and 20% independent. I was raised by one Democrat and one Republican. They walked to the polls together and canceled each other's votes out for my entire life. But, you know, the reason I tell you this is I know that we're in a very difficult time here in this nation, and I know that it reflects or has reflections into our relationship, our transatlantic relationships. I believe that this current administration is very challenging to many aspects of our long-standing alliances and our long-standing relationships. But I believe that many of us on both sides of the aisle are deeply committed, despite all of that, to knowing that science and security can't wait for the political winds to change. Time is really, really important, and we need to be working on this now. I will focus your attention on Chapter 6 of the Biotech Commission's report. If you get an opportunity to read the Biotech Commission's report, Chapter 6 is a good one for this audience, which is titled Mobilize the Collective Strengths of Our Allies and Partners. And it makes a point very powerfully that the greatest gains will come when we are able to work together, pool capital, pool talent, pool infrastructure, and make sure that our policy frameworks align with one another. So I would encourage everyone to read that if you haven't already, because I feel as though in many parts of this report, it's a little bit gloomy. This is an optimistic part of the report in terms of what we can do working together. I also happen to work on the Armed Services and the Intelligence Committee, and I have the opportunity to see every day that biosecurity and biotechnology is no longer a niche concern. I really want to make sure if there's one thing I leave you with is that this is something that we should be concerned about. In many ways, I feel like that a lot of us miss the boats on things like cyber technology, artificial intelligence, supply chain integrity, all of those kinds of things. I think we were too late to recognize that they were vulnerabilities, but I don't think it's too late for us to collectively recognize that this is a vulnerability that we need to work on. Because as I've already talked about, China is well aware of this, and in some cases is ahead of us. Russia is also reminding us of things like biological threats, and we need to make sure that we are working with each other with tools to ensure that biotechnology is developed responsibly and ethically, that it's never weaponized, and that we have the tools that we need to be able to respond quickly together in the event of such a misuse, which is absolutely possible. So I know that that's also sort of gloomy, and I want to make sure that you understand that here in Congress, here in Washington, we are taking the results of the Commission's report really seriously. The Commission made 49 different recommendations. Almost every single one of them is a recommendation that's legislative, but most of them, the vast majority, are also squarely in the hands of the Congress. And the good news is that we've taken those 49 recommendations and we're beginning to chip away at them, many of them through what's called the National Defense Authorization Act that I'm sure some of you guys are familiar with, also referred to as the NDAA. A lot of the recommendations that were in the purview of the defense world were put into this year's NDAA, and hopefully they'll make it through the process when the government opens of being included and codified. We also were able to include many of the recommendations of the Commission in the IAA, which is the intelligence version of that report, of that piece of legislation that usually goes along with the NDAA. And so I'm hopeful that we've made some progress at chipping away at that, but we still have a lot of work to do in the other areas, and would ask you guys to help us elevate that as being important. The last thing I'll leave you with is there's also hope in that this Congress, the United States Congress, has also recognized that this is important enough that we've organized what's called a caucus. A caucus is basically a high school or college club, but for Congress people. And the caucus is a bipartisan caucus that's focused on biotechnology. It's run by me and Stephanie Bice. I'm a Democrat. She's a Republican from Oklahoma. We've worked together a lot in the past. The good news is there's 20 of us already that are in that caucus, and that we also have what's called a Noah's Ark requirement, which means you have to join 2 by 2. You have to join one Republican and one Democrat in order that it doesn't politicize something that should not be politicized. And so we're working to make sure that our fellow colleagues are educated on this issue of biotechnology and biomanufacturing, so that more than just a few dozen of us understand why we need to worry about this. We have much to learn from our European allies. Several EU member states and the EU itself has already developed plans and is in fact sometimes much more forward-looking than we are. Harrison and I got to go to Denmark last month, I guess it was, and got to learn a lot about what's going on in that relatively small nation that is a superpower on this particular issue. We stand at a really pivotal moment, and I'll conclude by saying that the promise is real of biotech and biomanufacturing. The opportunity is real. The threat and risks are also very, very real. But I really believe that through collaboration, through shared values, through understanding what it is that we have in common, that we will be able to lead the world in harnessing biotechnology and biomanufacturing for good. Thank you again to the Center for European Policy Analysis for allowing me to pontificate on this really, really important issue. If you have any questions that we might be able to help you on, our office is just up the hill, so to speak. Harrison Jumper is my right arm on these issues, and we would welcome any questions or ideas that you have. Thank you very much for having us today.
So good afternoon. It's such a pleasure to be here. My name is Katie Sendak. I'm the director of the Transatlantic Defense and Security Team at CEPA. It is so nice to see so many familiar and unfamiliar faces as we delve into tech and defense tech policy. I have the absolute privilege today of introducing our next segment of this conference. We are going to have a really fascinating fireside chat with Christian Brose, the President and Chief Strategy Officer of Anduril Industries, and our President and CEO, Dr. Alina Polyakova. So if I can, welcome you both to the stage, and we can get started.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here, and I hear the conference is doing exceptionally well. But I think it's going to get even more interesting now because
We shall see.
we shall see. Because I have the honor of hosting this fireside conversation with Chris Brose, who's, as Katie said, the President and Chief Strategy Officer of Anduril, a really innovative, incredible company that we've been following for a very long time. So, Chris, I have been reading your many interviews in the Wall Street Journal and lots of other media outlets. And I wanted to just get right into it, right? Because there's so much we could be talking about. But I was really struck with a comment you made in an interview you did over the summer, which I recommend everybody to read because I thought was one of the best things I've read about how we should be thinking about the future of our collective defense. And you said, and I quote, at every level, I think our conception of military power and the industrial base that we've been optimizing to build it is just systematically wrong. That's a super strong statement. What did you mean by that?
That's a great question. So for the purposes of this, like when I was saying we, I meant the United States. I think when I say we throughout the rest of this, I'm going to mean the United States. And then like I probably assume that the problems of Europe kind of generally rhyme with the problems of the United States, even if they're not completely similar. I guess what I meant by that is when you kind of dig into the assumptions of how the U.S. has been thinking about military power, probably for a generation or more, it's basically been, we have assumed that if we have to fight wars, they are not going to have to be very long wars. They're going to be over relatively quickly. We will have technological superiority over an adversary. And as a result, we're not going to have to shoot a lot of weapons. We're not going to have to lose a lot of systems. We're not going to have to replace a lot of things. And again, because all this is going to be over relatively fast, we can get through that. And I think that, the evidence to suggest that that is wrong has kind of been all around us and in our face, right, for a decade or more. Certainly what you see in Ukraine, certainly what you see in the conflict in the Middle East now, years in the making, and then going back to Nagorno-Karabakh, Azerbaijan, Armenia, et cetera, where I think like the assumptions are actually the reverse of what we have been planning for, where wars are probably going to be months and years. We're going to have to get back to the notion of thinking and planning for protracted conflict. We're not necessarily going to have technological superiority when we enter the battlefield. We are going to have more contested environments and contested fights. We're going to lose a lot of systems that we weren't planning to lose, and we're going to have to replace a lot of things, both combat losses and depleted weapons that we had not necessarily been planning for. So why is it wrong? I think it's wrong because we're off by about an order of magnitude, the amount of capacity that we're going to need to prosecute a conflict like that. And we do not have the industrial base that can build at that scale and sustain it at that sort of period of time. And this kind of gets into, that conception of military power that we've been building up very much leads toward just very expensive, very exquisite, very hard to produce military systems and weapons. I believe there is still a role for that. I just think that it is far from being sufficient in terms of how we're going to be successful in the future.
So, just as a quick follow-up to that. So what you're describing, I think you've said this in the past as well, is that we need a mass-producible, adaptable, scalable, and replaceable military capability. You've just described what our current military capability looks like and why it is not suited to the future and even the current conflicts. So what does that future military power actually look like then?
So I think the future is going to be a high-low mix, right? And what I mean by that is, look, I'm all in favor of the high-end capabilities that the United States and our allies have in terms of, B-21s and F-47s. I believe we need all of those things. I just don't believe we're going to get them in large numbers And to the extent that they get held at risk, we're not going to be able to replace them quickly if we lose them. So I guess what I focus on is then how do we complement that set of more exquisite high-end capabilities with sort of a family of lower-end, more autonomous, more mass-producible systems. So, I think a lot of times when we look at Ukraine, we very much focus on like the expendable things, right? FPV drones and 155 shells and things of that sort. We probably need a bit of that too. I think that what we really need is this kind of more, it sort of has the attributes to a little bit of the both, right? Where you're talking about low-cost systems, but nonetheless systems that can cover larger distances, carry larger payloads. So, at Anduril, we're working programs for the U.S. Air Force in like collaborative combat aircraft, which is basically a robotic fighter jet. So again, not a cheap sort of expendable, buy it off the shelf type of capability, but it is priced to such an extent and sort of built in a way that the whole purpose of these systems is that you want to get them back if you launch them. But in the event of a conflict and you have to lose them in large numbers, you're capable of doing that and replacing them with some degree of speed, certainly faster than we're going to replace fourth or fifth or sixth gen manned combat aircraft. So really kind of thinking through like each of the different types of capabilities we have, how do you begin building sort of low-cost complementary systems to those so you end up with more of a mixture of systems where you have a smaller number of high-end systems and weapons that are hard to produce, hard to replace, but then you probably have 10x the volume of lower cost, more producible systems that you can blend together into ultimately a more lethal, more survivable, kind of salvo or mixture of capability.
So I think this is probably a good pivot to thinking about the European, defense and security environment right now, because, I think as everybody knows, there's been a massive shift in Europe on how Europe is thinking about its own security. We had the big decision over the summer in The Hague about the commitment to 5% or 3.5, 1.5, however you want to talk about that, spending of GDP on defense by European NATO member states. And this was hailed as a huge success. And the unlocking of resources and financing for defense is some describe as a revolution in Europe. I personally am a little skeptical. I'm not sure we're in the revolutionary phase yet, but I think certainly there's a potential set of opportunities coming together here, right? One is the new focus on defense spending in many European countries. And two, the fact that you can actually build up much more rapidly with the kinds of systems that you're describing, because Europe can order all the F-35s they want, but they're not going to get them for 20 years, maybe longer than that, right? And that's the kind of lag where I think there's a potential opportunity to fill that gap in capability that Europe has with some of these more low-cost replaceable capabilities that you're talking about. So I guess my question for you is, do you think that it's the resources that are getting unlocked in Europe slowly, but they're getting there, are going to be spent in the right way to ensure that Europe can also become a more capable military power?
I hope so. Far be it for me, to kind of guess whether that's going to happen. I guess I'm optimistic. I kind of have to be optimistic. I want to be optimistic. Part of the reason I think I'm optimistic is, look, if the resource levels that are being committed materialize, and frankly, even if 75% of it materializes, you're still talking about a significant shift upward in European defense spending. Why I'm optimistic is that is a significant shift above where the kind of current European countries are. And there's not, sort of a huge clamoring of, like in the United States, right? If we were to increase defense spending that much, it would be spent or allocated in a hot week with all the different programs of record, who would love to gobble up that money. I think there's just an opportunity in Europe to sort of have net new thinking and net new program creation. I also think, and I'm prepared to be challenged on this, that the European countries, collectively, painting with a broad brush, are learning the lessons of Ukraine more than the United States is. Obviously, proximity matters in that regard, but I think that because of that, if that is true, I think they're more inclined to drive those lessons into where future defense spending is going to go. And perhaps, I'm sure there will be acquisition of, some degree of legacy capability, some degree of kind of very expensive, exquisite, high-end capability. But I am optimistic for all of these different reasons that there will also be a desire and an interest to move into, kind of this different class of capability that is lower cost, more consumable, more mass producible, which, by the way, would allow Europe to punch way above its weight class, right? Would allow smaller countries to punch way above its weight class because you're not tethered to fielding capability based on the number of human beings and the number of money or the amount of money that you're spending on it. With autonomous systems and with lower cost systems, you can actually multiply capacity in a way that allows smaller countries to punch at a much kind of higher level, and that allows Europe collectively to operate at a much higher level, which I think is good for Europe and frankly good for NATO and the United States.
So everybody likes to think about leapfrogging, right? I haven't really seen that being a successful strategy in the military and defense space. But is that almost what you're describing, right? That Europe will not be able, certainly themselves, produce the exquisite systems that we can in the United States. They may not be able to get our systems from us just because of our defense industrial base issues. But do you think that from what you've described, almost sounds to me like Europe could build this very capable force, that it would be a better fit for the kind of conflict that you're describing that we should be better anticipating at?
Yeah, I think, again, my belief is that it will be a mix, right? And some of those resources will go to, kind of more legacy systems, more exquisite systems. But I do think there's a huge opportunity for Europe to leap ahead. I think there's an opportunity for Europe to disrupt the United States, and to actually lead turn the United States. We're doing a lot of work, we at Anduril, with the Australian Navy, where in an extra large autonomous undersea vehicle, Australia has the most capable system of that class in the entire world. And obviously I'm biased in saying that, but I challenge you to prove me wrong. Europe can do that too, in a whole different series of classes of autonomous systems, weapons, and other capability, where they could move a lot faster than maybe the United States, with all of its process and bureaucracy and frankly resources, might be able to. I think it's just a matter of thinking differently about the problem, thinking differently about what military power and deterrence are going to look like, and actually having the will and the imagination to move out in that direction. And I think that's going to be the big limiting factor, is will the national will materialize? Will the resources materialize? And will they go in the direction of new types of programs that can establish a new kind of deterrence?
So you already brought up deterrence, and I wanted to go there next. Everybody here knows and has been following, I think, closely the incursions that we have seen into European airspace over the last couple of weeks. Obviously, the Russian drones that entered Poland, and some of them were shot down, but only about 20%. There were 21, I think about 4 were shot down. We are seeing drones disrupting air traffic in airports in Germany and Denmark. We haven't identified the source of those drones or the origins, but we could probably take some guesses there as to whose they might be. But I think what this has brought up to me is that, we don't really have a theory of deterrence, and we don't really have a deterrent capability against these kinds of threats. Do you think that you've had a NATO hat before you were at Anduril for so many years when you were in the Armed Services Committee? Do you think that the alliance is moving towards some sort of operational concept of deterrence, or are we just kind of sitting ducks?
So the comments that I'll make, and let me preface by saying, I think all of the problems that we're seeing in Europe are also present in the United States, right? There's plenty of drone incursions in the United States over U.S. military installations and other places where we do not want drones flying. I struggle a bit from the outside, right, in terms of I don't have any special intelligence briefings on what's been happening in Europe, to know, were these drones flying despite the fact that they were detected? Were they flying but they weren't detected? Were they detected but we couldn't? There's no capacity or capability to do anything to defeat them. I think the big concern that we should have, and I say we by the United States and Europe, is, if there were an attempt to run an Operation Spider's Web in the United States or in Europe, I think it would absolutely be possible. I think we are living on borrowed time. I think we have been for years. I think there's a lot of reasons why we are not where we need to be, put aside deterrence, from just a self-defense standpoint, right? I mean, if these drones go from doing, kind of targeted overflights and intelligence gathering to kinetic operations or something disruptive, I worry that we don't have enough of the ability to defend ourselves in the United States or Europe. So when you get into the deterrence aspect of that, I think it starts with being able to actually defend yourself and having the capability, the will, using authorities that exist to say, look, it's like all against the law that these drones should be flying where they are. Let's start by enforcing the law and taking them out of the skies. Let's actually not allow whomever is on the other side of that to incur a benefit from breaking our laws and violating our sovereignty. And if we can't do that, then how in the world can we sleep well at night believing that, if something more nefarious were afoot or were to happen, that we're actually going to come out the right side of that? Like, I think this is the whole problem is like we're living in like a September 10th world and looking at a potentially September 11th type problem. And I just think, again, like we're all living on borrowed time here. I think my hope, optimistically, in the United States is, with the emphasis on Golden Dome and, Homeland Defense, that there will be finally, a sort of systemic, like national level, continental level attempt to get to the right side of this problem. My hope is that Europe does the same.
We were talking earlier just about the levels of defense spending needed in this country, and obviously this administration is thinking a lot more about homeland defense before we probably are thinking about supplying our allies, right? And you can make the argument either way, whether that's the right decision or not. But as a percentage of GDP, U.S. defense spending is declining. I mean, it's still huge in absolute terms, right? But do you think that we don't have the national defense strategy yet? But if you, again, were putting back on your armed services hat when you were the director of that committee on the Senate and worked for Senator McCain for years before that, how would you be thinking about the National Defense Strategy, the NDAA? Where would be the appropriate kind of budget lines that you would want to see?
So I think it's very easy to sort of like take everything that I'm saying and then sort of jump to the conclusion, oh, well, it must mean that we got to cut defense spending and, get rid of a bunch of legacy programs. I actually don't believe that. One, because I believe that like this mix of high and low is actually very important. Two, because I think, and like I have the political scar tissue to back this up. I think the kind of period of change that I'm describing as necessary is far more likely to be carried off in an environment that is not resource scarce, right? When the pie is shrinking and everybody is fighting for a shrinking, share of the pie, what I've seen in my time is that it's the new stuff that ends up losing out. So I actually think it's important to have a robust defense budget in the United States, to have an increased defense budget in the United States, so we can actually ensure that investments are getting made in new capabilities, even as we're sort of moving through this transition of how we think about military power. From more of a kind of line item sense, I think the biggest problem we have is we need to create new programs. I'm kind of tired of Washington is just a very process-driven city. And for every problem that bedevils us, we point to some process that is the reason for why we are not where we say that we are. So the JCIDS process was a problem. Now we have no more JCIDS process. The budget process, the acquisition process, pick a process that's a problem. Again, prepared to be challenged on this. I actually think we have all the authorities we need to do pretty much whatever we want. Acquisition authorities, budget authorities, and otherwise. The problem is that senior leaders who have those authorities all too often don't understand the authorities they have and or are not willing to use the authorities they do have to disrupt their own systems and make, significant change. And when I say significant change, I don't mean nibbling around the edges of, maybe we'll do some science projects and some innovation theater. I mean creating new programs, like school bus-sized robotic submarines and like autonomous fighter jets, and a whole world of new weapons programs that cost a fraction of what our legacy weapons are and can be produced at 10x the volume to complement the traditional munitions that we have. There's probably 25 new programs that need to be created at scale and resourced with billions of dollars. Even then, as I sit here today, I would tell you that's probably single-digit percentages of our defense budget to get right. But if what we're arguing over is single-digit percentages of our defense budget, that means the difference between having a future and not having a future. So like I would argue we do need a robust defense budget, but we also need senior leaders both in the executive branch and on the Hill, certainly in Europe, both legislative and executive, who have a vision for where we need to go based on the lessons of modern conflict that we've all been learning, and are going to create new programs to bring those new capabilities into the hands of our warfighters to generate deterrence at scale.
That's a lot of work for a lot of Hill staff to do and a lot of members to do.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not all on the Hill staff, right? I mean, I honestly think, you know, in all of our systems of government, right, the prime mover needs to be the executive branch. It needs to be the national leadership. Like, they're the ones who need to step forward with a bit of a vision for where they want to go and the hard decisions that they want to make. And look, Congress comes in for, you know, a lot of criticism these days. And I'm cognizant as I sit here in the middle of a government shutdown that they deserve their fair share of it. That being said, I've never seen the Congress more on a bipartisan, bicameral basis, eager and desirous of changing and willing to support change. But I'm not going to expect all of that change to necessarily arise from the Congress. And that doesn't mean that the executive branch gets a free pass, right? They have to come with a well-thought-out plan and a well-thought-out strategy and resources that make sense. And again, I don't think that I'm saying anything that wouldn't also be relatively true in a you know, pick your European country context. So again, like, to me, the biggest limiting factor we have, and I say this in a transatlantic sense, is will and imagination. I think we have authority. I think we have money. I think we have world-leading technology and phenomenal people. In many senses, we remain the envy of the world. We just need to get out of our own way and stop blocking our own kicks and actually have a theory for where we're going and how we're going to get there on a timeline that makes sense, rather than, you know, saying, like, you know, we're going to change and we'll all have nice things in 2040, which is all too often the way, you know, kind of modernization looks like in our kind of democratic context.
I have one last question for you, because I know we're at time. But you know, it strikes me that we've been having this very thoughtful and interesting conversation, but we've primarily been talking about hardware, and we're talking about capabilities, right? And it really strikes me that, well, one, Anduril, of course, does both, and so many companies do. And it seems to me that the future military strength and capability is actually all about software that can adapt rapidly, respond rapidly. We're seeing this in theater in Ukraine all the time, that the updates that they're looking to are basically software and OS updates. And then they can plug in, you know, 700, 400 different systems, however many the Ukrainians are now, you know, bootstrapping together, as long as they have a common system that allows their commanders to make operational decisions. And of course, you know, Anduril's Lattice was one of the key products in this space, one of the revolutionary products here. So I guess my last question to you, you know, as a company that does both, right? And you've been in the company now for some time, how do you think about that balance between the need to also invest in software, which is invest in human capital, talent, and all of that, at the same time as you invest in hardware that is going to last, but be replaceable, scalable, all those things we talked about?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think, I mean, I know you would agree with the comment I'm about to make, right? It is both. We cannot fight only with software. We cannot fight with hardware that is not reprogrammable and rapidly updatable. So it really becomes, I think it's less about, you know, kind of, is it hardware, is it software? It's more about the velocity of change and adaptation that we need on a modern battlefield. And I think your comment about Ukraine is spot on, right? They are changing it that way because they have to. Because if you field something that works today, like, congratulations, it's not going to work in a week or a month or a year. So it's really about being able to change everything from the software to the mission systems and payloads to the platform or whatever other element, software or hardware, at the speed that you require. So software is going to change daily. You know, if you design a system the right way, you know, you can snap in and integrate different payloads and mission systems, you know, relatively quickly. But again, that is not how we have traditionally defined and built military programs here, right? They end up being black boxes locked by traditional vendors, where if I want to make a change, man, like, take an order, pay a huge amount, and wait years, and then maybe you'll get it. And if you're lucky, it won't be obsolete by the time it rolls off the line. We've got to get beyond that. So I think the sort of the class of capability that we're talking about also lends itself in that degree. So it's really more about, like, how do you put mass back on the battlefield, and how do you change it at the speed that you need to, whether it's software or hardware. And then when you lose it, are you capable of reproducing it and regenerating it quickly? And I think that's where, I mean, as Anduril has taken its journey, you know, scaling and moving into sort of large scale manufacturing, our theory of this is you actually have to just design systems from the beginning to be mass producible. And if you don't do that, you're going to be bedeviled by all of the things that are preventing us from scaling our legacy capability production critical materials and, kind of bespoke, customized, subcomponents and highly specialized workforces and all of these things that don't scale. So if you design a system to leverage commercial manufacturing processes, commercial supply chains, if you make compromises for, I'm not going to pick that exquisite material because I'm never going to have a lot of it, I can make do with something less. Again, I think that's the lesson of Ukraine, right? They're not gold plating anything, right? They are making things that work for them and that they can generate, sort of a speed and scale of change. Again, whether that's software or whether that's hardware, I think that's the main lesson we need to learn. Again, going back to the beginning of this conversation, that is not how we've thought about military power. We think we're going to design a program, we're going to have it for a generation, we'll never really have to change it, and then we'll think about a next generational upgrade, and that is an obsolete way of thinking.
Well, Chris, this was an incredibly interesting and strategic conversation that I think has left me certainly with a lot of ideas and things I've learned through having this discussion with you, and I'm sure everyone else feels the same way. It's such a cool company that you've been a part of, and I know you've been there since it was almost a startup, right? So it's been kind of amazing to watch it grow, and I think everything you're just describing and the vision you're setting forth is something that I think we all need to really pay close attention to, because if we don't get this right, I mean, I fear to think what we'll be in 10, 15, 20 years, just in terms of our ability to provide the kind of safety and security that we've all grown very accustomed to, right? And I think your comment that we're all living in borrowed time, I think strikes the exact chord. So thank you so much for your time, and thank you for being here.
No, appreciate it. Thank you, Lena. Thanks, all.
Thank you so much, Chris, Alina. What a wonderful conversation, and what a wonderful lead-in for our final panel of the day. I am honored to be moderating this final panel focused on an eye towards innovation and discussing Europe's defense tech boom. I'll put that in quotation marks to see if this conversation really leads in that direction. It is an honor for me to welcome to the stage our three panelists this afternoon. We have Ms. Jen Stewart, the Executive Vice President for Strategy and Policy at the National Defense Industrialists Association. We have Robert Jekyll, Chairman and CEO, Airbus U.S. Defense and Space. And we have Lieutenant General retired Steph Twitty, who was the former Deputy Commander of U.S. EUCOM and is a member of our International Leadership Council here at CEPA. So if I may welcome our panelists to the stage. As I drop my notes. Oh. Thank you. So again, welcome to our final panel. We are the only thing keeping you from a reception, so we will make sure that this is an interesting and compelling conversation. I know because our panelists, I get to know our panelists, so I know it will be. Over the last 3.5 years since Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, we have seen in many ways Europe wake up to the security needs of the continent with an adversary at its front door. There's been a myriad of programs, announcements, resources, funding. A lot of them were just discussed in the previous conversation, and I think that those have been points of discussion all day. The EU initiatives, NATO 5% spending, capital initiatives and defense investments. It almost feels overwhelming with the amount of options out there to address security concerns. But what does it all mean in practice? I think this is what we want to talk about today. What does an actual European defense tech boom look like? What does it mean for the US in terms of cooperation and collaboration? What are the challenges, bottlenecks, and opportunities between both the US and Europe? We are already 3.5 years of learning the lessons of what is happening in Ukraine, and there is still much work to do, all with a very rapidly evolving defense technology environment. So I would like to get into it. So happy to have our panelists here. Thank you so much for being here. I'm going to start with Jen Stewart. And I think what we want to get is an understanding from the industrial base writ large and how you're seeing things. What does that landscape and dynamic look with all of this influx of resources and investment, all of this focus on how do we meet the capability needs? From your perspective, what does that landscape look like right now?
Thank you, Katie. And I'd be remiss if I just didn't quickly thank Alina, yourself, the center, and of course our very generous hosts at this beautiful facility, the House of Sweden, for hosting all of us today.
Absolutely.
You know, I want to start, I was watching as they were resetting the stage, and I want to frame my comments around how healthy I thought your generous sponsor list was, because it reinforced my opening remarks that I wanted to make today, which is, with my background, the reason I'm at the association I'm at, we have 1,800 members, and we have every sector. We have companies that represent every single business model that there is out there, from publicly held to employee-owned to private-backed to individual LLCs. And what we're trying to talk about, and I was really struck by Chris's comments earlier today, is we need to shift the conversation from we do these niche things very well, and now we're going to pivot and start doing these niche things very well, to an and model. And what I say by that is, with deep respect for the honorable fighting that is going on by the Ukrainian people to defend their homeland, there's an opportunity to miss a couple strategic lessons we all need to collectively think about, which is, I always cite our combatant commanders who are charged with educating the public about what they see from their area of responsibility. And when you look at the European Command testimony over the last several years on the Hill, they talk about what isn't consumed right now in Ukraine. And so as we've engaged with the member companies, and as we've engaged with senior leaders in NATO and the individual member states in the European Union, what we've really talked about is we need to go back to basics and understanding what we need to do to optimize defense strategy that allows for optimization of business strategy, that can focus on production, that knows how to manage workforce, that honors the skill sets across a range of capabilities, including those individuals who are true artisans who know how to produce at scale, who know how to sustain and maintain those high-end equipment, and then we also, and munitions, and then we also need to focus on what is required to recruit, not just into government, but into these key sectors when we're competing with them for purely commercial companies, the digital skill sets that we'll need to maintain our competitive advantage. And then the last thing I would say is I really do try to emphasize the importance of supply chains. And I always lead with an area that I think is overlooked when we talk about latency and meeting timelines, which is people. Every single time I'm asked for a rule of thumb of how long it's going to take for something to happen, we first talk about what it would be required to get the workforce in place in order to do it. And I would also say on supply chains, one of the areas where I think we need to work closely together between the US and our NATO allies and our EU allies is the conversation that by mid-century, the technologies we all believe are going to define the strategic economic competition are technologies where our governments don't have primacy. The three areas I want to focus on just briefly are space, artificial intelligence, and quantum computing and sensing. And so our frameworks right now are predicated on an assumption that the governments will be in control of those technologies. And our frameworks for controlling those technologies are premised around non-proliferation and are not premised around the economic and strategic competition we find ourselves in. So hopefully that's enough fodder that if you want to come back, you can talk to me about it.
I just wrote down about 17 more questions I want to ask you, Jen. The and model is so interesting. Really quickly before I turn to Rob, what you're seeing from the association perspective, do you think that that's a common thought in the industry sector of everyone's acknowledging it can't be niche, it has to be the and?
I would tell you, I assess that conversation has evolved as the year has gone on. There is absolutely a trend in Washington, both DOD and certainly on the Hill, to make sure we're setting better conditions through acquisition strategies, through contracting processes, through contract vehicles, and certainly how we fund on the Hill to make sure that we're opening up increased competition opportunities for non-traditional contractors. And that's a statutorily defined term. But as I've observed over the course of the year, and particularly coming off of Operation Midnight Hammer, what I've been struck with is where I'm watching the senior leaders in the department spend their time. And if you look at the reorganization and the areas where the Deputy Secretary of Defense is, through his leadership, making sure that he is personally getting oversight, it's in areas such as submarines, munition production, and the production of 5th and 6th gen aircraft. And I think we should pay attention to that.
No, thank you so much, Jen. That's really, really helpful. I think that leads in really nicely, Rob, where you sit at Airbus Defense and Space, as we look at these multiple domains that Jen highlighted, as you look at this space, what specific part of the industrial base do you think needs the most focus as we look at these resources, as we look at trying to get everybody on the same page in terms of capacity and capability?
Yeah, well, thanks for the question, and thanks for allowing me to join the panel. CEPA is a credible organization, and I'm a proud member of NDIA as well, and really honored to be with my new friend, General Twitty. Airbus, we're a foreign-owned company, but we're set up industrialized in the U.S. under special governance regime so that we can do national security work. Primarily known for commercial aviation, but we also have space, military helicopters, fixed-wing, multi-mission rotorcraft. When I think about the industrial base, I'll probably tie back to what Chris Brose said, which is, I agree with what he mentioned, we're going to need this high-low mix moving forward. And that means that you're going to have sufficient funding for some of those long-term, exquisite systems, whether it's F-47 in the US or FCAS or GCAP in the UK. And then you're also going to need the capability to scale smaller batches of attritable systems, whether it's collaborative combat aircraft or the modular buses that we're building in Florida for Space Development Agency that can be modified quickly and scaled quickly as innovations are onboarded, and using things like modular open systems architecture, right? So you scale the hardware. We're doing this with helicopters. We're taking some of our lower cost helicopters, converting them to uncrewed variants with a modular open systems architecture. So when those iterative innovations take place on the sensor and software side, you're not vendor locked forever. But that requires, back to your question, consistent funding, consistent demand signals, regular appropriations. If you want scale and you want investment and you want a defense industrial base or an extended defense industrial base, so that's allies and partners, having that repeatable, consistent business case is important. Otherwise, you're really reliant on dual use business cases. So we've had a lot of success. In fact, I look more favorably today on dual-use business cases where I have a commercial satellite manufacturing capability or a helicopter that can service the civil side and the defense side. I'm de-risking these government shutdowns and the failure of having regular appropriations. That works maybe on some of the lower-cost stuff, but when you're talking about exquisite systems or even things like 155 rounds, if you want to stockpile and have inventory and the industrial capacity to scale up quickly, you just got to have consistent funding. I mean, it's kind of simple business case mathematics. And I do see that as being a bit of a risk. I think Chris Brose said we're living in a September 10th mindset. I'm with Senator Wicker on this. I think, from a percentage of GDP, we're less than the Carter administration right now, even with this one-time bump with reconciliation. So if you want that scale, you're going to need a better sense of urgency. Doesn't mean the money shouldn't be spent wisely. It doesn't mean we shouldn't be more efficient. But I think both on the European side and on the U.S. side, more funding, consistent funding, and in Europe, maybe to close, because I'm talking about the extended industrial base, allies and partners, because we sort of straddle both sides. I would say the same thing across the European nations. What does this 5% or 3% look like? How is it going to get spent? Is it aggregated? Is it going to get balkanized over 12 different national champions? You know, I would question whether that's going to get the European industrial base where it probably needs to be. I'll pause.
No, Rob, those are fantastic points. You know, it's really interesting where there's so much opportunity coming out in terms of what capitals and organizations are trying to do to increase capability and capacity, but there are still so many avenues of risk in terms of funding, consistency, leadership. And again, you know, as we've all heard multiple times today, we're sitting in the middle of a U.S. government shutdown while the private sector is trying to plan, while the private sector is trying to predict what is to happen. Same in Europe. Where they're facing some of their own political, obviously, issues as well. But you lead in really great to what I wanted to ask Steph. So I'm gonna turn to Steph with the 5%. We talked about this briefly earlier, Steph. You know, how do we ensure that we're getting the right things across the alliance and partnerships? If there's all this money, how do we do it correctly? If you were king for the day on spending that 5%, you know, how should we do this?
Yeah, I am a king, by the way.
Right. Every day.
Thank you very much. This has been highly educational today. I've been with CEPA all day today, and I've enjoyed my time. Hey, I spent a lot of time in Europe. In fact, I spend more time in Europe than I actually spend in the U.S. But and the reason why I say that, I want to say something that I totally disagree that I've heard all day today. And I've been waiting for the opportunity to say it, so I'm going to say it now. Deterrence. Deterrence. First of all, I'm not building a capability to deter. I'm building a capability to fight and win. And I hope you guys are with me in this. Because guess what? Since World War II, we've been sitting on the periphery of Russia or Soviet Union, and we've been calling it deterrence. See where it got us? We need to build capability to fight and win and to kill folks. Okay? Cool? Coming from a 40-year infantry guy. I spent 40 years in the Army. And so that's the first thing I like to pass on. The second thing I like to pass on. Chris had a lot of great stuff to say, and I agreed with 99.9% of what he had to say. But here's what I disagree with. I never went to war thinking that it was going to be over in a day or 2 days and so forth. And I don't think you're going to find anyone in the U.S. military services, the service. Now, I'm not talking about the politicians. I'm not talking about the civilian public. I'm talking about our great United States military. I don't think you're going to find anyone that wears the uniform, that's getting shot at every single day, that's going to say the war is going to be over in 3 or 4 days. And do we have veterans in here? Any? And I think they would agree with me on that, okay? So that's the second thing. The third thing that's leading into the question, Katie's question. Look, I will stand behind what I'm saying, and I'll stand behind it until I die, and I'm looking down from heaven. War is a human endeavor, and it's going to always be a human endeavor. Now, yes, there's a lot of technology out there, and what leads me to believe that it's a human endeavor, because I've seen it up close and personal. Out of the 40 years I served in the military, half of it was in combat, and I was fortunate enough to lead the command that sieged Baghdad. And once we got in Baghdad, quick war story, once we got in Baghdad, this is what really convinced me that war is a human endeavor. So out pops this probably 22-year-old young girl, a lady. She had a baby in her hand. And my troops saw the weapon that she was also carrying. So what do you do from distinctive standpoint when you see a weapon? What do you do? What would you do? You would quickly pick it up and kill her, right? Right? Yes or no? This is not a trick question. Okay, so She's saying this depends on the situation. So I'm a father of 2 women, 2 girls, okay? So when I saw them do that, sometimes you got to take risk. So emotions. So it is the morality, it's the moral compass that you don't get out of boxes and machines and AI. They could have killed that woman and the baby on the spot, and it would have been justifiable. Right? It would have been justified. She had a weapon, she was a threat. But I made the decision to take risk and not kill her, but yet use other means to get her to the ground so she could live another day, okay? And so it's always going to be a human endeavor. I don't care what we bring to the fight, okay? What I'm looking for is capability to complement our soldiers, airmen, Marine, and also the Space Force and anything else that want to join us on the battlefield, to complement that fight. You're not going to see a world where it's totally robots on the battlefield doing our nation's business and fighting our nation's wars. I don't see that. I do see a world where it is machine, and we call it in the Army, machine and man teaming, and where you can reduce risk on the force. And then the other thing associated with that, the technology that we're talking about, that we're bringing to the table here. If you look at what's going on in Ukraine, if you look at what's going on in Gaza right now, it's not a game changer. It's not a holy grail. In other words, no one's packing up their bags because they brought some piece of technology to the battlefield that wins the war. And we have to make sure that we keep our minds focused on that. There's no holy grail out technology that I've seen, okay? There's still going to be boots in the mud. There's still going to be other capability and exquisite capability. I like what Chris said. He was spot on. It's the integration of capability. But that integration of capability is designed to reduce risk on guess who? The soldiers on the ground that's fighting the war.
Yeah.
Okay? So, what kind of capability are we talking about? If we want to win and not just deter, what does that capability look like? And so we talked about this 5%, and everyone's all happy about Europe spending 5%, and I'm happy, having been the deputy commander of U.S. European Command, that they're spending 5%. But what we need to do is be smart about the 5%. And so we can't open up the Christmas store and say, okay, everyone run to the barn and purchase the same stuff, okay? NATO has something called collective defense. So along with collective defense, that means we're going to play ball, we're going to play teamwork, we're going to work together to secure our common good in NATO, on the European continent, and across the transatlantic. You all agree with that? And so therefore, there should be priorities from NATO on where we want to spend our investments, and priorities going to countries on where they should. They can't tell them to do anything. But what they can ask is, look, we need shoring up in these places and give countries priorities to where they spend this money. Of course, yes, the right thing to do is spend it on country stuff, so you're going to see that happening. But the other right thing to do is share the 5% to make sure that you're prioritizing. And we're all not all just buying drones and thinking that we're doing good for NATO. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
And so those type things that I will tell you, not only NATO as in Europe, but also the U.S. we're hurting in. And if you don't mind, I'm going to run down a couple of things. Is that
Sure.
okay with you?
Please.
You're in charge, so I just want to make sure I can. Okay, so Huge problem. And I'm running down these because I do spend a lot of time in Europe talking to a lot of defense firms, and we're really trying to figure out where can we get certain capabilities. And so as I rattle off these things, if you have capabilities that goes into the areas that I'm talking about, please come and see me. Number one, Intel. Okay, so as we sit here today and we look at how NATO gets its intelligence, it's a hodgepodge network that is really not laced together. And I will tell you, when the bullet starts, we're focused on making sure our network's secure and all this stuff. Once the bullets start, I can care less whether the network is secure or not. What I'm looking for is the ability to pass intelligence across a network that's going to get to the person that needs it most. And so we need a collective network where we can pass intelligence and pass other critical things. So that's one. And that includes, obviously, the C2 capability. Second thing, you're witnessing it in Ukraine now. Our air defense posture in Europe is bad. Now, I could throw our own country into that box. Our air defense posture here in the U.S. is bad. We have not invested enough money to ensure that we can do some of the great things that you see Israel doing with its Iron Dome capability. And so we really need to invest in an air defense posture, not individual air defense that you're seeing in Europe now. A collective air defense posture is what we need to invest in. Hypersonics, very expensive. And so, as we look at the 5%, who can do more, you're going to have a lot of countries that won't be able to invest in hypersonics, and you're going to find countries that will be able to invest in hypersonics. We need them badly. You can reach out and touch a little bit further with hypersonic capability. You've seen the Russians do that in Ukraine. The other one is, and you guys know this, drones. But I'm not looking for MQ-9s. I'm looking for the little bugs, the class 1, 2, 3 capabilities that we provide to our soldiers, and they don't have to call back to headquarters and say, "Mother, may I?" They can pull it out of their rucksack.
I got some of those. You told me to speak up.
Yeah, you see? Yeah, they can pull it out of their rucksack or their pocket and really save the day. And so that's another one. Our logistics is going to be seriously contested. Okay, if you really want to bring down NATO, focus on the logistics. Seriously contested. So how do we protect logistics? How do we anticipate requirements? Things are going to break. Right now, we don't anticipate requirements. What we do is we buy all this stuff, we stockpile it for the enemy to blow up, and the next thing you know, it's all gone, and we can't fight. Contested logistics will be huge on the modern-day battlefield. Next one, mine clearing. You see the Ukrainians. They're doing God's work out there with very little equipment to clear mines on the battlefield. Should never happen in the modern day fight, okay? So robotics to take on that fight. And then the last one, and I'll shut up. We have a lot of problems in NATO right now with interoperability. So all this stuff that I'm talking about, it's got some type of technology to all of it, if you think about it. All this stuff is going to have to be interoperable. If we want to fight together, if we want to win together, if we want to defeat the enemy together, we have to be interoperable, and we have to be bold about being interoperable. If you go over to NATO right now, they will brag about how interoperable we are. And I will tell you, we're not interoperable at all. Okay? So, I know I talked a lot, but I had to get that out.
Thank you, Steph. I appreciate it. I'm going to pick up on something you said with Jen, which is interoperability and interchangeability, which we briefly discussed before the panel. I think from an industrial perspective, how are we looking at this from industry in terms of collaboration and cooperation between the U.S. private sector, European private sector? Is everyone aligned on the interoperability goals and goalposts?
So I had the privilege to attend Chatham House rules dinner last year associated with the summit for NATO's anniversary with some senior folks from NATO and also some of our most senior CEOs in the United States industry. And privately, they would tell you that there's more work to be done. We are still approaching the problem set as if this can be solved by a theater solution. And if you take seriously the words multi-domain, multi-spectrum, multifunctional, that the U.S. military leadership, including Steph, have been talking about for a very long time, there has to be an assumption that it's going to quickly expand any regional borders and require a coalition approach. And respectfully, that is not how we're approaching things right now. We're approaching it as opportunities to find competitive advantage. And this is just, it's an area where, and you know, I was listening carefully to the general, and I think if you were to ask me, the thing that I worry most about right now is we are very focused in our public policy conversations around the technologies we know we need for the changing character of war. But he surfaced an important point that we can't decouple from the conversation, which is the enduring nature of war. And this is, I think, going to be a critical time period to take a look at, and this is why I talk about and. You know, going back to the Gulf War, we had air supremacy, uncontested logistics, and for those of us who were not on the ground, it felt fast. And then we had 20 years of warfare where it was a smaller and smaller percentage of the U.S. and coalition forces that were deploying. And we had to resource a low-intensity conflict. And I sat through plenty of budget meetings in the Pentagon and on Capitol Hill where we made deliberate choices in delaying budget decisions involving strategic stability, involving our most exquisite platforms, involving munitions from everything from 155s up to the most exquisite. And so the big takeaway for me right now, and where the association and industry is driving, is we don't know what is coming, but what we can see right now with the incursions around the European airports, what we can see in Ukraine, but also what even our commander-in-chief has talked about with submarines, is it's going to be multi-spectrum, it's going to be multi-domain, it's going to be multifunctional. And for the first time in the US context, which is where we're going to be catching up with our European friends, we are confronted with the reality that the US homeland is not a sanctuary. And the most likely opening moves are going to be in space and cyber. And it's not just holding the US population at risk, it is holding at risk the strategic infrastructure that would be required to mobilize the joint force, and it also be required for them to communicate if we are overly reliant on digital communication.
There's risk when we go down that road, and what does that look like jointly is always a question. I feel like sometimes we make 2 steps forward and 3 steps back, and we make a series of decisions taking on risk and then stepping back from that risk. So Jen, I really appreciate that perspective. But speaking of space, and I think this is a domain that, you know, everyone wants to understand more about, you know, a future potential conflict and what that means on day one, exactly to your point, this multi-domain approach. Rob, I would love to hear your thoughts on this, you know, in terms of collaboration, cooperation with European partners, in terms of, you know, all the buzzwords out there, co-production and joint development and joint interoperability, you know, from where you sit in a domain like space, is there opportunity to do this? Or is it going to be, you know, US over here and this country over here? And how are you looking at that?
Yeah, on the topic of interoperability, what we've learned really the last 10 years is the products that we build, and we are historically a platform company, fixed wing, rotorcraft, also satellites, but they're only relevant insofar as they are now connecting into this joint all-domain command and control, which is multi-domain, space, airborne, ground. And challenge one, as the general pointed out, is can you interoperate just within your own branches through joint, and that's not always easy. Joint programs, joint interoperability. And then the second challenge is, okay, now you're talking about allies and partners. When it comes to space, I do see opportunity there. I mean, in terms of co-production, we're sort of already doing that. We've taken heritage European commercial satellites that we've produced for commercial constellations. We moved the footprint for those production capabilities to the U.S. We modified them, greater size, weight, and power, and those are now part of the transport layer and the tracking layer for Space Development Agency, which is the comms link for JADC2. And so that's, in my view, resource sharing, leveraging investments of allies and partners and producing them in the U.S. In terms of interoperability, once we sort out, and I think setting common standards for communication interfaces, data standards, that will help industry, allied industry, to build to those standards so that they can interoperate. And that will allow what I think is another opportunity for interoperability of space constellations. General Saltzman, I was just at the Air Force Association a couple weeks ago, and General Saltzman was saying, hey, if I can pull resilient comms or imagery off of allied constellations, it doesn't have to be a military constellation. It could just be a commercial constellation. But if I can pull that off as a resiliency, I save a ton of money here in the U.S. And I think that is an opportunity. Space Development Agency is looking at building what's called translator sats. So this is sort of the relay. You think of baseball, right? Who's the relay guy? He catches the ball and then it goes back to home base. This is your translator sat that can help interoperability between secured MILNET military constellation in the U.S. and allied constellations. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there. It remains a challenge, but I think having common architecture standards, data standards, interface standards will allow industry on both sides to build, and they don't end up with hey, I built a square peg and I got a round hole. And this is the depth of my engineering background, by the way. So that's as technical as I get. But you kind of get the picture, right? That's not going to work. Absolutely. If you have common standards, then it's going to kind of be like the iPhone, and everyone builds to the standard, and it can work, and we all save money as democratic allies with common pacing adversaries. So big opportunity, a lot of work to be done, but I see a real will on both sides of the Atlantic to do this. Yes, Europe wants its own sovereign capability in space. Yes, there is a fear of being dependent on U.S. space, on launch, on constellation, on GPS, and so it's good. It's good for us as Americans that they're spending money on those capabilities. But I do see an opportunity and a logic for interoperability and leveraging those investments, because in a fight, it's gonna be a allied integrated defense fight, and you're going to need to be sharing data in real time with AI, data fusion, sensor to shooter across all of these constellations. So, and where Airbus is pushing on both sides of the Atlantic in that direction.
Well, I really appreciate that. So before I go to my final question, then I'm going to ask each of you, and I'm going to let you give a second to think about it. Are you sitting in this moment of where we are in terms of capability, capacity needs, investment on both sides of the Atlantic, optimistic or pessimistic as we move forward? As I said at the beginning, we're already 3.5 years into, quote unquote, learning the lessons of what we need or may need in the future. So I would love to hear, where you fall on the pessimism, optimism spectrum. But quickly, I want to follow up with Jen, and if I can I put you on the spot here just for a second in terms of what you're looking at from the industrial perspective in the regulatory realm? We heard a lot of talk about reforms to FMS and ITAR and export controls, all of those things that kind of hang over the head of some of these conversations, which we need another all-day seminar on, so we'll work on scheduling that as well. But Jen, from where you sit, I mean, do you see motion? Do you see positive motion to alleviate maybe some of those concerns or some of those issues and challenges from the regulatory perspective?
I am really encouraged by what I'd call the leadership energy out of the administration, but I would say at the operational level, there's still a lot of more work to be done. And it's not just regulation. I had a series of meetings actually this week to talk about the need to modernize how the US government is organized around these issues. And this is also informing something that we're trying to remind people about, which is our frameworks and our discussion with our allies are premised on the fundamental fact that they were set up when the US government had a monopoly on our strategic technologies. Exactly. And that is no longer the case. Right. And I still remember, this actually goes back to the beginning of the Biden-Harris administration, and there was a really interesting conversation about the continuity between President Trump's first term and the Biden-Harris administration and what was happening at Commerce and BIS with export controls around sensitive supply chains.
Interesting.
And so I would just say that's an area where I think that there is more work to be done to get beyond just having very polite conversations to having technical conversations backed up by a shared understanding that we all need to step out together in a new framework. And yes, there is going to be natural competition. This is, part of our values, which is private sector innovation. But I think this is a watch area for us. The other area that I would just highlight that doesn't come up with this one but is equally relevant is the conversation going on about all the different ways that strategic guidance from leaders in the Department of Defense don't get translated in terms of cost, schedule, and performance. In the area of regulation, for example, we still have, and they're doing their job, so I don't want to come across as negative or disrespectful to them, but we have auditors at DoD, and it is their job to make sure that companies are following regulation. And we still have regulation on the book that dings companies for having idle facilities and idle capacity.
Interesting.
So right where you have actually continuity in the conversation about the needing to ramp up production, and we don't even have a common understanding of that because some people think you're going to ramp up quickly for a finite period of time and then ramp back down. And to be blunt, the service budgets are giving good reason for investors and C-suites to think that. They're getting dinged for doing what they're told
penalized
that they should be doing. And so I think there's a lot more work to be done, but I think that there is enough leadership energy behind the issue that you can actually start pushing the door open, sometimes knocking down the door to say, they're serious, so we need to get serious.
I love that. Leadership energy is, as we all know, extremely important to move anything forward. So I'm going to start with Steph real quick because we're at the end of time here. Are you optimistic or pessimistic about our ability to meet the requirement?
Okay. I am overly optimistic.
Okay.
Notice I said overly. and I'm going to explain to you why. And so when I go around, I hear a lot of people say, wow, it sure is getting bad out here in the world. I have a different perspective. Again, having served in the Army for 40 years, and when you talk to a military person that's been deployed for most of those 40 years, the world looks just the same. The world looks just the same. There's two things in my mind that's different. Number one, it is the axis of the aggressors. You all know who they are: North Korea, Russia, Iran, China, that are in collusion like we've never seen before. I've never seen that in my 40 years of service, where they're all working together. So that's the first one that's different. And the second one is different. It's the immersion of all the technology that we're seeing come to fold in the battlefield. But everything else is the same. And you need to rest easy, whether you're in Europe or whether you're in the United States, that we still have the best military in the world, bar none, and that we will spank the Russians if need be. You need to rest easy about that. You think about it. The Russians have not won a strategic victory in Ukraine. They won tactical victory, but Kyiv is still alive and well. Kharkiv is still alive and well. I can go on and on. And they've been active for how long? Okay?
That's right.
I do have some concerns about China. Yeah, we're woefully behind China in some capability and some capacity, but that's okay. I can guarantee you your leaders are really focused on making sure that we outpace China, and we will get there. But for the most part, I'm optimistic.
I like it.
We're going to be okay.
Thank you, Steph. Rob.
Well, boy, I was on the fence, but General Tweedy, I think you really pulled me over to the optimistic side. It's easy to focus on the challenges and even with the transatlantic alliance and some of those challenges, and as Chris Brose says, the sense of urgency, is it there? But I do think the commercial innovation, allies and partners, those are our asymmetric advantages. Yes, China, it's a complete fusion, top-down, civil, military, governmental, and so very difficult to compete on a mass basis. But I don't think anybody's going to out-innovate us. And then the final element that makes me positive, I spent 8 years working in Europe. Years ago, you had to defend why you were in the defense business, and you had ESG investors saying, well, why are you in that? You should just be pumping out A320s. And it's okay if you have military helicopters, but this other stuff, why are you doing it? It's a night and day. Right. And so I think the wake-up call in Europe is encouraging. So and in the persuasive words of General Twitty, I'm going to vote optimistic.
I love it. Thank you, Rob. Jen, please.
I'm going to be completely independent and still be positive. There's two reasons, and I'm deadly serious about both of them. First, when you look at the assessments about competitors, we are seeing firsthand with Russia and Ukraine, and we are inferring with other competitors that what they don't have is trust and confidence in the execution of the military operations. When you have senior general officers who have to go to the front lines to detangle convoy lines. So for the United States, the professionalism of our non-commissioned officer corps, which is a unique characteristic of the United States the United States military. But even when you look at our allies and think about coalition fighting, if we are forced to fight, not only will they have physical superiority because of their conditioning, they're going to have cognitive superiority because we train to think independently. Yep. And to be able to know when to seize the initiative rather than waiting to be told. But as you were seeing in Ukraine, there is a qualitative difference in fighting when you don't have to be explained to why you are fighting. Yeah. And democracies, when they go to war, they understand why they're going to war. Yep. On the industry side, why I'm genuine, because I ask myself, am I just giving myself my own marketing thinking? What encourages me is whether I'm, doing site visits for factory lines for some of our most established companies, or I'm engaging with some of our most innovative technology companies that are now moving into the defense space, or defense startups that are led by young veterans who know what they didn't have when they were deployed, and they're like, right. By God, that's not going to happen to anybody else. You just sit there, and your first thought is, I've done nothing with my life. These people are brilliant. Yep. And so that's why I'm optimistic.
I love that. Well, yes, very well said. It is time to have a reception and have a drink after a wonderful CEPA Tech and Security Conference. Please join me in thanking our panelists for a wonderful discussion. Please. Thank you, thank you. Thank you, Steph. The president and CEO of CEPA, Dr. Alina Polikova, for some closing remarks. Alina.
Thank you, Katie. I'm not going to stand between anyone and drinks, which are downstairs, and really amazing popcorn that I just had a chance to snack on. But I will just say a couple of words that this has been an incredible set of conversations. We celebrated our 20th anniversary today and yesterday with our awards dinner that we hosted here in Washington, as well as this Tech and Security Conference. And I'm just so grateful for the team that put all this together. Of course, thank you to the embassy and all the embassy staff that made all this possible. Ambassador Allen in particular for being our gracious host now for, I think, the second year in a row. We'll be back next year because look at this beautiful space. And you know, tech and security is really the theme for CEPA, for not just for this year, but for our future. So I hope all of you will continue to follow our work. We are also hosting similar conversation at the intersection of tech and security in Brussels, in Europe, as we're a true transatlantic institution. But my job here is just to say thank you to Katie, our amazing Director for Defense Security. Thank you to Ronan, our Director for Technology Policy. Thank you to our CEO, Geisha Gonzalez, and our entire events team that I see here, Julianne and Zoe and Maddie and Matthew, many, many people that I will probably forget to name if I don't see your face right now. But it's been an incredible day of events, incredible day of conversations that are both substantive and thoughtful and strategic all at the same time. And I'm just grateful to everyone for your time. And that's a wrap. Thank you. Please go have a drink.